I'll just get us rolling. Thank you so much for coming. I think most everybody's been here, but there's a few of you who are new. Are you getting it working? No.
Maybe not.
Demi's troubleshooting.
You're supposed to say test, and then it
That
works.
magically makes it work.
Magically makes it work.
This is a really special evening, and I really appreciate everyone coming out to share it with us. For those of you who haven't been here, this is Demi, Raven, and my house.
Your biggest fan.
He usually does that while we're clapping.
You can see us all wrapped up in the enthusiasm.
Okay. So it's kind of a hybrid, performance space, but also studio in our living room. So it's a little bit unusual. Hopefully you found the restroom and the snacks and beverages. Just help yourself. And let's see. Usually we like to do a land acknowledgement. So we're acknowledging that we are here on the unceded lands of the Coast Salish people. And specifically here, the Duwamish tribe, which is still waiting for recognition, not waiting, but hoping to get recognition from the U.S. government. We actually do pay rent to the Duwamish. You can do that if you're interested. I can tell you about it. You can. But yeah, we try to recognize that and resist the erasure of the indigenous people whose land we're on. We're located here. So with that, do you want me? Yeah,
I can make an introduction. As you know, we're here for Hysteresis, Profile of Brion Gysin. This is by Roger Knoebber, and it's a very special book. It's taken us here at this table about 3 years to get here. It's taken Cosmo 20 years of holding on to the manuscript. And Roger, almost 30 years since he completed this. Roger is no longer with us. He died in 2004. And he's on the video monitor in the back there for people to watch. I have a mic because I'm very soft-spoken and I don't project well, so apologies for that. If you can't hear me at any point, just do this. I'll do my best to speak up, okay?
Is the volume okay so far?
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's my good ear, yeah.
What I want to talk about first, I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to move over to Theo. What I'm going to mostly discuss is the history of the archive, how this came to be, and a little bit about Roger, a little bit about the history, without going too in-depth. I think Cosmo will talk more about that. And then I'm going to read a little bit of an introduction, a really lovely, I was originally going to talk, I have this little guide for Gysin that I've been working on. So I have a chronology, and I was going to bore you with a chronology. And thankfully, I came across the introduction to Jason Weiss's Back in No Time, the Brion Gysin Reader, which is fantastic as an introduction to Brion Gysin. And bear with me, it's about 4 or 5 pages. I'm going to read those for you. I think you'll get a really good overview of Brion Gysin. Those of you who aren't already deeply familiar, I know there's some here who will be, I've heard it before. And then I'll read a little bit of the introduction to Hysteresis as well, so you get a flavor for Roger Knoebber. After that, I'm going to pass it to Theo. Theo is the publisher of this book, Inkblot Publications. I'm really honored to have him at the table with me.
Thank you.
I've known about Theo's name long before I ever got to know him. And it's been a marvel to make a friendship through the experience of doing this book together. I got to edit the book, which is lovely. That was a good experience for me as well. And as the owner of the Roger Knoebber archive, it's given me a greater depth into both the Brion Gysin and Roger Knoebber, and just the history and dynamics of a really broad friendship. Theo will be talking a little bit about Inkblot and his history with Brion Gysin. He published a number of works while Brion was alive. Some of those, we've got one after his death that's up here, but there's a number that I'm sure he'll talk about. Cosmo, this is the son of Roger Knoebber. Also very honored to have him at this table. representing Roger, who's on the photograph here as well. And to give a little bit more insight into Roger and the qualities of him going through his youth in the Gît Hotel and living in California and eventually going back to Paris, which I think is a wonderful story. All right. And then I'll close with a couple things from the book and as well as maybe the afterword if we're not bored by then. So does that sound good?
That's great.
All right, great.
Beautiful.
Fantastic. So I'm going to talk a little impromptu about the archive, and you'll correct me and state me if I'm wrong on any count or if I get a date wrong. 2021. I'm a little background. So I am I'm an archivist. I'm an independent scholar. I'm a bibliographer, book collector for sure, book hoarder to some. And material to some. But I really have a focus in Burroughs and Gysin. And I'm on this group called on Facebook called Burroughs and Associates. It's really the place to be for sharing information about William S. Burroughs and the people around him. And Cosmo kind of came out of nowhere to me, posting pictures of letters and interesting things. And he said, "This is my dad. My dad lived in the Gît Hotel and was close with, and Brion Gysin." And I kind of was like, what? I've never heard about Roger Knoebber. Who is this person? And reached out to him for a couple reasons. One, I was curious about what is this that he's talking about? What is in this archive? But also, if he does have this, what does he want to do with this? Because, this has kind of been quiet for a long time, right? And also, it's a big group full of people with mixed intentions, and I felt a little protective of the material. So I reached out to Cosmo.
He didn't want anybody else to buy it.
I'm not that greedy. I put this all online. I'm not that greedy. I can share that with you.
You referred me to another buyer before.
I did refer you to my credit, right? But I reached out to Cosmo, and we had a little conversation. He sent me a bunch of kind of skewed photos on this phone camera of different things, and I went, "This is really interesting." We had some conversation. He brought someone, I think, from the Beat Museum to look at it. That kind of was and we talked. Someone else wanted to take part of it and not all of it, and I said, "Don't do that." I said, "Don't do that." There's a ton of letters. There's a ton of ephemera about Brion Gysin. There's a whole history in here that is interesting. I want to know about it. So I flew. I flew to where he lives in California with Janet, who I really owe a lot of thanks for her patience with all of this and support. And Janet came with. She was working part of the time, but I sat for a week pretty much in the kitchen with you as we went through bins of material and trying to make sense of what it was. Who was this to, and who is this person, and what's the history of this? And at the end of it, he said, "Well, do you want to make me an offer on it?" And I really hadn't thought about it at the time. I said, "We'll have to talk about that." Not thinking that it was possible, really. In that, there's a bunch of letters from Brion Gysin to Roger Knoebber. There's a typescript of the Poem of Poems, which is one of the earliest cut-up poems from the Gît Hotel by Brion Gysin. There's a copy of that on the wall there for people to see.
Which he gifted to my dad in 1962.
That's right.
Written at the Gît Hotel.
Brion loved Roger, really loved Roger, and they maintained a friendship from the time in the Gît Hotel until Roger left in '62, and then they wrote to each other from '62 to '84, and Brion encouraged him to come back to the Gît Hotel, where they lived together on Rue Saint-Martin for in different.
It wasn't the Gît Hotel.
It wasn't the Gît Hotel.
It was,
not Gît-le-Cœur, but Rue Saint-Martin, right?
Correct,
yeah,
right.
And right across from the Beauvoir Museum, and they maintained a friendship until Brion Gysin died in '86. At which point he said, "I got to write this book." And first it was an anthology. He turned around on that because someone else was working on an anthology. He said, "I'm going to do a kind of memoir." But it's an unusual memoir This is a profile of Brion Gysin. You know, most biographies that one will read talk very deeply about what someone did in some sort of order. And they did, you know, sense of importance over time. And this really gives a whole other dimension to Brion Gysin, I think, in that it talks, it's a conversation of Roger, and really now the spirit of Roger, with the spirit of Brion Gysin. It's very hard for a person to read. I'm not going to read you too many passages from it because I'm not that much of a thespian, but it's really back and forth. And to kind of buffer his own subjective viewpoint, he brought in other people and said, hey, I want you to bring a recollection of Brion. And those are folded into this manuscript. And so I think it's a really special thing because it gives Brion Gysin not just as a historic figure, and we'll talk about him in a second, all the things that he did. We'll talk about that biography. But as a person, and not as a person, just a person, but as a friend, and as someone of really dynamic potential. And I might have gone off track, but I think I'll leave that with that. Let me read you a little bit, if you'll indulge me, this introduction from Jason Wise. I think it's really quite good. Yeah. And see if I can still read with my glasses here. Brion Gysin used to refer to himself as a man from nowhere. Not surprising, given his multiple origins and thoroughly international existence. When Paul Bowles ran across him in New York in the 1940s, Paul Bowles, I'll interject, his Sheltering Skies, some of you have read him, lived in Tangier most of his life. I'm going to interject a couple times. He described Gysin as then being into his fourth nationality. But perhaps the phrase that Jorge Luis Borges used to describe some of his own characters might be more appropriate. In his life as in his art, Gysin was a man from the border. His restless curiosity kept him always on the move, going where it pleased him, carrying no baggage. Such perhaps was the ideal, yet it was also in large measure his inescapable reality. Such a nomad at heart kept returning physically or magically to the various far-flung locales that had formed him. In this age when scholars and readers are eager to think across the disciplines, to find connections between cultures, to discern the underlying matrix of an artistic movement beyond fixed notions of identity or traditional expectation, as if any of these tendencies were new. Surely it's time to reassess the work of Brion Gysin. And I personally think this. I mean, I'm biased, of course, but Brion Gysin is a really, really interesting character. As singular a figure as any, he was often dismissed for not being entirely a painter or not entirely a writer, and not entirely a lot of things. He was really a jack of many skills and disciplines. He continued to explore both domains for some 50 years with the inquiring intellect and instinct that expressed itself differently according to the occasion. And worse for him, he did not hold still within the media, nor devote the bulk of his efforts to a chosen genre. He came and went, alert to creative openings, following his ideas in and beyond such practices simultaneously, alternatives sequentially. If some consider him essentially a painter, and a hell of a painter, there's some pictures on here of it. There's probably 500 or so works by Gysin in the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. Certainly in MoMA, he's well established after his death. His production of visual arts more accomplished. His fascination with writing and the mystery of language remains nonetheless central to all his output. He did speak 7 languages. As a writer, his insightful understanding of history, I think Theo probably talked about this a little bit, combined with the expansive flair of a born raconteur, to set his prodigious imagination in motion, produced long and short fiction, historical narratives, poems, song lyrics, travel pieces, memoirs, experimental forms, and more. Taken as a whole, his versatility shouldn't be regarded as a wild display of his excess talents, but instead as an ongoing method in the art of opening, of uncovering paths which many younger artists took up in turn. All right. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Practical matters aside, as some people know, he very connected to William Burroughs. They were, for a long period of their history, practically shoulder to shoulder. But he had friends in all sorts of circles. Peggy Guggenheim, Susie Weiss, all sorts of. You'll find a bunch of names in Hysteresis, some of his connections. And I think that's really one of the things that defined him is his broad social connections, his ability to speak to high and low and people on the sides, on the margins. Okay, practical matters aside, the question of identity did not plague Gysin. On the contrary, it provided ample room for play. Instead, Indeed, the theme of search for identity is found in his work, and most especially its opposite, yearning to be free of identity, to vanish in the sea of language, a texture, a vision. It's not unlike James Joyce's description of the artist in the portrait of the artist as someone who would ultimately disappear into the work of art. Gysin affected that mood repeatedly in his various practices. In writing, the cut-ups were the first of his disappearing acts. Cut-ups being, the slicing of text and rearranging with a little bit of intention to produce new and unexpected connections in writing. And he revealed a like impulse by other means in his novel, The Process, his first major novel. In a first text printed in Udo Breger's journal Softmead, issue 17, which is the Brion Gysin special, he reflected on the matter of his own identity, and I love this kind of quote. Thanks for indulging me here. A sorcerer's apprentice, follower of Aleister Crowley, once asked me if I knew my real name. I was dumbfounded. I don't. Burroughs has told me he knows his, not me. I have often been in doubt about it and written a number of poems in which I attempt to dissociate my I from my me. And without pushing this to the point of schizophrenia, I've always felt rather doubtful about my me. To begin with, I have an unusual surname of Swiss origin, fairly rare even in Switzerland, I'm told. Family came down from the hills in the Middle Ages and settled in Liestal, a small town just far enough and independent enough from Basel to wage a petty provincial war with the big city and lose. The Gysin of the day lost his head, and the family moved into Basel around 1500. My given name is Brian. My Celtic mother was thinking of one of those insufferable phony kings of Ireland and spelled it with an A. Brian. Official documents took care of that and spelled it Brian, And like the famous wine of Bordeaux, Ho Brian, I accepted this gladly and dropped all my other given names when I became an American citizen. I was sent to Downside, school for hybrids in the west of England, run by Benedictine monks, a triumph of my Catholic mother whose zealous decision sat so ill with my Zwinglian Protestant family, a lot of dropping in Gysin's writing, that I ended up with no inheritance at all and in hysteresis. My mother's family barely survived on pseudo-aristocratic pretensions, while my father's family liked to think of themselves as solidly Republican middle-class folk. I've never accepted the color or texture of my oatmeal freckled skin, bad packaging, I thought. Certain traumatic experience made me conclude that at the moment of birth I was delivered to the wrong address. I've done what I could to make up for this. All right, so this is where it gets more crisp on the facts. Throughout his life, Gysin moved back and forth between 3 continents. Born in London in 1916 in Taplow, England. Didn't really know his father, who was declared missing in action before the end of the First World War. His mother raised him in Western Canada in and around Edmonton. So he was sent off to be educated in England in the early 1930s. In 1934, he moved to Paris. He studied briefly at the Sorbonne and made his first literary and artistic contacts by way of Sylvia Beach and the Surrealists. The following year, he was to have his first show as part of the Surrealist Drawings exhibit, but his work was taken down the day of the opening on orders from Andre Breton for alleged insubordination. Now, this was actually taken down by Paul Eluard by order of Andre Breton. Andre Breton wasn't ordered someone else to do it. It was either, and there's kind of 2 stories to this. One, either because he was gay, and that wasn't very favorable within the Surrealist movement. In fact, I think Brian called himself 100% gay, although I think it was more like 99.9. But there was also a story of that he did the drawing for the poster of that exhibition, the original drawing of the poster, which had a face of Andre Breton, which was not flattering. Later in the decade, he traveled in Greece and Algerian Sahara, returned to Paris, where he had his first one-man show in 1939, and he lived on the Rue Gît-le-Cœur. That's the way goes the heart, right? This is classic rundown tenement building, basically. This is the worst of the hotels in Paris, but it was a place run by Madame Michoud.
Scale 13, which is...
Scale 13, thank you for the facts. It was about as low as you could get without getting condemned. But Madame Michoud, who ran this, had a kind of penchant for artists. She had worked with, I think, been close to Monet at one point in time, and if you were a creative person, she kind of wanted you in her space. So people were brought in, and that's how Roger Knoebber kind of got connected. All right. So he returned to Paris. He had his first one-man show in 1939 near the Place Saint-Michel. Now this is the same gallery that he was kicked out of, which isn't mentioned here, but he kind of, I got it. But next he stayed in Paris for an extended period. 20 years later, beyond the same street is what became known as the Beat Hotel. So this man Rue Gît-le-Cœur is the Beat Hotel, and it's kind of interchanging the terminology. With the onset of the war, went to New York. He worked as an assistant costume designer on Broadway musicals. I think he did 7 musicals. And then as a welder in the Bayonne shipyards before joining the American Army, which is kind of an interesting bit. And then here he managed to get transferred to the Canadian Army, learned Japanese, was really interested in calligraphy. He started getting interested in calligraphic paintings. You can see some of these on the wall. He met Tex Henson, great-grandson of Josiah Henson, the real-life model for Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom. And after the war, having become an American citizen, he returned to New York. He published his first book, To Master a Long Good Night, which also contains a history of slavery in Canada. It's an interesting nonfiction work that he did. It's a historical narrative based on the life of Josiah Henson, which had a long dependence, as I said, on slavery. And on the basis of this work, he was awarded one of the first Fulbright fellowships. He returned to Europe. He kind of didn't make good use of his Fulbright fellowship, so to speak. He didn't do what they expected of him, but he did get him back to Europe. And he did some research in Bordeaux and Seville on the history of the slave trade. That's a little bit of a stretch, it's pretty quick. And then on the invitation of Hubbles, he went to Tangier in the summer of 1950, and he established residency there. This is kind of where it gets really interesting, I think. In the winter of 1951-52, went across the Sahara, an adventure that not only inspired his sketchbooks on the time, but became part of the process, again, his first novel. Years later, in 1970, although through Bowles, he first heard the master musicians on the hill town of Jijuka. Enchanted by their music, Gysin went into business with them for about 3 years, where he opened his restaurant, the 1001 Nights, where they performed. There were also dancing boys and acrobats and fire eaters, and it sounds like a really fantastic.
A lot of wealthy people.
Yeah, one of the Jijuka people, Hamri, was the cook, so really nice. And people would come from all around to go to 1001 Nights. He maintained a friendship with the musicians for the rest of his life. He introduced Jijuka and later used to Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones and saxophonist Ornette Coleman. Brian Jones released them on LP. That's how they got popular here. In Tangier, he met William S. Burroughs, whom he had first encountered in New York. I'm not 100% sure about that. And then, though a friendship slowly developed, it wasn't until the end of the decade in Paris that they became close collaboraters. And in the mid-50s, as Morocco gained its independence, and they took over the international port of Tangier, a lot of artists went to Tangier. It was free. You could do what you wanted. Drugs, young boys, whatever you needed to do, you could do it. You could find it there. And it was cheap, right? It was cheap. And artists love cheap places. Yeah, you need cheap. So it got tangled up in extravagant affairs of John and Mary Cook. This resulted in the loss of his restaurant. It also, apparently, there was a curse, some text that was put on the
Mention who John and Mary Cook were.
Occultists.
They were part of the founding of Scientology or Dianetics. They worked for Hubble directly.
I thought they had a cult connection too.
They did, but they were top of the grade, whatever. I don't know enough about Scientology, but they were right up there with Hubbard, and they were clear.
They got connected later on. The Algerian episode reappeared in the process, and by 58 he's back in Paris. He's residing at the Beat Hotel. Burroughs had a room, Ginsberg and others lodged from passing through. Knoebber lived there from 59 to 62, which is where a little bit of history we're trying to recapture, I think, here. And it was there that Gysin first discovered the cut-up technique of writing and the principle of his permutation poems, painted extensively, co-invented the dream machine, which is spinning light flicker machine, right?
See someone behind you.
Yeah, there's a little bit right there, right there.
You see the dream machine
Yeah,
right there. Good timing, man.
I appreciate that. He invented that with Ian Somerville. Ian Somerville is a computer scientist and mathematician, lover of Burroughs as well. Performed numerous experiments, often with Burroughs using tape recorders, other materials, film, other things, performance art. Permutation poems. which essentially taking a small phrase and permuting it multiple times. And his use of tape recording led to Gysin's being regarded as one of the founders of sound poetry. So when you think sound poetry, some people think Henri Chopin and things like that. I'm not trying to say I've heard people. Those were his friends. And then from then on through the rest of his life, he performed such work at galleries and poetry festivals. All right. And I promise you, I'm getting close to this. Intermittently during the early and mid-60s, Gysin tried to market the Dream Machine. I think this is really important in the letters of Gysin to Knoebber. There's a ton of references to this. He tried very, very hard. He was hoping at last to resolve his perennial financial problems. He was an artist that had a hard time, no problem making work, no problem making interesting things in the world, very hard time selling them, very hard time marketing them. And so, again, sometimes things happen a little late. And Roger Knoebber as well. Described the Dream Machine as the first art object to be seen with the eyes closed, and with some practice it could indeed provoke a dreamlike state. Contraption seemed simple enough, blah, blah, blah. Throughout the decade, he went back and forth among Paris, London, New York, Tangier, worked on various projects. His literary work mainly comprised the collaborations with Burroughs on The Third Mind, although it was published until much later. The process, until the end of the decade, his own screenplay, based on Burroughs' Naked Lunch, which was never produced. So some people don't know this. He wrote the screenplay for the original Naked Lunch movie that never happened, right? And much closer to the tenor of the book than David Cronenberg's, which is kind of a biography of Burroughs filtered through David Cronenberg. In the late 60s, he began to write a new work of fiction. Each draft of the novel evolved further from its original purpose of chronicling the Beat Hotel. And it was published in 1986, shortly after his death as The Last Museum. It's an interesting book. It's got a Keith Haring cover on it. Another one of his last books is called Fault Lines, which has some excerpts from that work with Haring drawings. There's only like 200 and some copies of that work out there. It's a beautiful thing. Meanwhile, he returned to Paris, settled into an apartment across from the Centre Pompidou, which was being built. By 75, was stricken with colon cancer. After surviving an infernal series of treatments and operations, he was determined to put his house in order, and he continued to experiment with different media, his use of photography in the mid to late 70s, and in a new development, he began to collaborate with saxophonist Steve Lacy. Do anyone know Steve Lacy? Yeah, great. On a number of songs. And there's a bunch of LPs where he wrote the lyrics, and he sings in some of them too, which is very, very interesting. They performed the songs as a duo. Gysin's energetic spoken, some of his delivery at poetry and jazz festivals, some of the lyrics. And this was really one of the things that Gysin loved the most in his end years. He loved performing, loved Ramucho Mata, loved Steve Lacy and what they kind of gave to him. Nova Convention, all sorts of stuff. I'm going to skip ahead again. On the last page of his introduction to The Last Museum, Burroughs drew a telling portrait of Gysin. Brion Gysin died of a heart attack on Sunday morning, July 13, 1986. He was the only man I've ever respected. I've admired many others, esteemed and valued others, but respected only him. His presence was regal without a trace of pretension. He was at all times impeccable. Who was Brion Gysin? The only authentic heir to Hassani Sabbah, the old man of the mountain? Surely that, certainly that. Through his painting, I caught glimpses of the garden that the old man showed to his assassins. The garden cannot be faked, and Brion was incapable of fakery. He was the master of the June forces, the little people who will never serve a faker or a coward. He was suffering from emphysema and lung cancer. He knew he had only a few weeks to live. I was preparing to go to Paris when Brion died. I have this last glimpse through a letter in her own English from my friend, Rosine Buhler. Rosine Buhler also is in the archive. Really lovely letter that she wrote to Roger Knoebber about this. Brion asked to wear his Chevalier de l'Ordre, pardon my French, the Art de la Lettre medallion in a very elegant way, and we started dinner with a wonderful Chinese soup. Brion finds the wine slightly repute to tease Francois de Palamini. Palamini, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Fafa to his friends, was spent and concentrated to find a non-alterated wine, which is not so easy even in Paris. After occurs a dreamlike talk about to have a large house by a sea in August, the shadowed room where all is burning hot outside, and Brion said he knew he would sleep well and was really happy of that good day. He wanted no help to lift himself from his green armchair and went to his room. I was watching his tall, straight-weighted walk, his secure path. Only kings and above people have it this way. So that's a nice picture, I think, of Brion More than a decade after his passing, Gysin's continued to gain new admirers, is in gallery and museum shows, blah, blah, blah. His work as a writer has become almost entirely unavailable. And this is true.
That has changed.
Well, it's changed today a little bit. We got a little bit here, and yeah, but it's still very hard to find some books about Brion Gysin and some of these books. And
I can get them all.
and he can get them all. So talk to the
Right,
if you
this is in the book.
Yeah, right on there. All right. I hope, yeah, so that's the introduction that Jason Weiss gives. I think it's really quite good, given the breadth, which is really hard to capture in the time that we have. And then I think, do you mind if I read one more thing? I'm going to read the full.
Absolutely not.
Thank you, my
I have
friend.
to talk less.
I'm going to read a little Roger. I'm going to read a little Roger.
And I'll talk after my own talk all night about Brion Gysin. Truly will.
All right. So this is the foreword to Hysteresis. And I think this is great because it gives a really good sense of. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. So thank you for catching.
I'll read part of mine.
You read your own. This is the one from Roger with a lovely picture of Brion Gysin with his final painting, which is the calligraphy of fire. I'm stepping over my words a little tonight. Huge painting, huge painting. Most galleries can't accommodate it. It's multiple panels, many years long. All right. Forward by Roger Knoebber. Thank you, Theo.
You're welcome.
Anybody ever tells you he knew Brion Gysin, get skeptical quick. Stand by for speculation, for Brion Gysin was unknowable, except, of course, in the biblical sense. Paradise lost and found. A great figure of his time, cerebral movement changed his expression, revealed his hidden strength. A visionary mystic. The boss was an absolutely fearless intellectual. If you were to experience lightning but one time in your life, you would never forget it, but never properly describe it. Remarks about Brion are bridled by the fact of unknowability. You'll get better if you read this book about Brion Gysin. Maxim, we read to be complete, we speak to be clear, we write to be exact. The boss was a voracious omnivore of books, a reader and a rereader, a discriminating bibliomaniac. I totally like that. His personal library is a boiling volcano of information, all stimulating. Always had Shakespeare at his bedside. Sends up metaphors, semaphores, Shakespeare William does. Once remarked that his 3 allotted desert island books would be The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, The Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs, and The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. A trained historian, Brion contemplated the history of the future as a treasury of myths, fiction being the principal means at hand for realizing history. As he bridged art and science, so he spanned fact and fiction and attained the truth, a matter of mood, wish, and dream. Brion Gysin strove to be complete. Brion spoke to be clear, to clarify. He sorted his thoughts through the medium of discussion, more than a mere manipulator of memories. His discourse was an uninterrupted series of bifurcations and side trips. A conversation with the boss was a flight to reality. Fugued again. Some conversations stumbled into ironies where he meant the opposite of what he said. Nimble erudition, he analyzed, he explained, he dissected, cut up. The Williamson term is a navigational procedure, followed when a person or an object is lost overboard on the high seas. The ship makes a 180-degree turn, a tight and precise semicircle, follows its previous wake in the opposite direction, backtracking in search of what went overboard. And sometimes when Brion executed a Williamson turn, I, an old seaman, would say, "Prepare to come about. Williamson turn. Handsome now," like the watch officer on the bridge to the helmsman. "Aye, aye, skipper," Brion would say. And once I asked, "How do you like it aboard ship, Brion?" And his deadpan response, "From the rear." Possible. His conversation was sort of a crystal, perhaps a kind of salt. Brion Gysin spoke to be clear. He spoke to be exact with pen, black ink, paper before him. He achieved great exactitude, precision, the natural result of reading and speaking, splendidly seasoned word salads. I think of his correspondence, his written remarks and opinions, his novels and his collaborative writings, his histories, his invented riddles and puns, for which he unfailingly apologized. Limericks, songs, all exact. As a painter, he achieved what was beyond his powers of written or verbal expression. Brion Gysin knew Brion Gysin well, perhaps too well, he might interpolate here, then as now a sort of Rococo Williamson term. Not knowing what is and is not knowing, I know not. I am that I am. The prospect of posthumous cultification disturbed him, for he would not, he thought, be here to keep things on track, thus preventing a disorderly approach. A creative person must have a sense of order, not always be orderly, but have a sense of order. Cultification would be chaotic and an unpredictable phenomenon. Danger of trivialization, no control like a cut-up. From the poem of poems, take the idea pure as salt, hold its sizes in the daylight, in the delight of salt, the mind shakes its tumult of spears. When Brion left us, a bit of history disappeared with him, misty dissolves which pass through the salts in the cortex, an unknowable man. Roger Knoebber, Paris, 1992, for Volume 2. With that, I pass to Theo.
Oh, you want me to go on?
Yes, I do. We're going down the road.
You're coming on right there. Beautiful. Beautiful. So I don't have much to say now after Demi's,
I don't believe that.
except I do. And I'm Theo Green, and I run Inkblot Publications, which I've been running for 42 years. I started it in California, where I'm from, and I started it to have an excuse to knock on Brion Gysin's door. I found out about Brion Gysin in the 70s, particularly because the founder of the Rolling Stones had made a record in Morocco that Brion Gysin provided notes for, although they'd been written for something before the record existed. But they were in this album of Moroccan Jujuka musicians. And I saw that name, Brion Gysin, spelled that way. And it was like really someone of a higher power tapping me on the shoulder and saying, look into this guy. Well, I did. And there were some good publications in the 70s that were interviewing William Burroughs and Brion Gysin. He's told you a little bit about some of their collaborations. There were articles about the Moroccan village of where the founder of the Rolling Stones went. So I just said, holy shit. You know, I was a Stones guy from the 60s. I said, okay, I have to find out more about this cat. Brion Gysin. So I did. And I found out that he had lived in Tangier, Morocco, where this other American writer, Paul Bowles, spent the last 52 years of his life. And William Burroughs, of course, had been in and out of Tangier when he wrote some of his classic books, Naked Lunch, etc. So I got the address of Brion Gysin from Paul Bowles and wrote to him in Paris. Burroughs wasn't known in the States in the mid-70s at that time. Gysin was nothing was in print. Paul Bowles, everything was out of print until, this is all pre-internet, and all of a sudden these people became well known again through the good graces of some publishers who said, these are very important human beings, artists, writers. In the Gysin, I fell in love with his paintings. His writings weren't available. I said, how can I change that? So I wrote to him, and he wrote me back in 1979. So I was living in London one year, and I said, I'm going to Paris. I'm going to knock on this cat's door. he answered the door. I was there at 2, and I didn't realize you're not supposed to get to somebody's house until 4 or 5 at tea time or cocktail hour. You didn't get there at 2 when people are still working. He answered the door, and he had his Moroccan jalaba on. It's a big Moroccan robe, jalaba. I think that's he's up in that picture there, which is right where I met him. And he said, "Come in." And I did. "Would you like some tea?" It was, anybody you go visit in Europe, "Would you like some tea?" And we talked. And I've written a piece about it, which I don't have here tonight, but I became fascinated with Moroccan music. I became fascinated with what information I could get out of this guy. Writer, painter, historian. So I said goodbye and went back to London, where I was doing some shady record business and stuff. And I went back to, I'm from Oakland, California, and I said, okay, all my friends have put out little magazines. I said, I am going to start a publishing company. And I was doing some scribbles myself, but I mainly wanted an excuse to go see Brion Gysin again. So I decided I would publish him. And I did. I had the good fortune to visit someone who was his archivist, a well-known book dealer in those days, Richard Aaron of Am Here Books, recently at that time of Switzerland and London and then California. He's now in Kansas doing, I don't know what, but he helped me get into the world of Brion. He had a huge archive, and he said, okay, you can photocopy all this stuff. You've got an hour. The copy shop is before FedEx and Kinko's. It was just little places on the corner, you know. You had to do one page at a time. These were all like on what, onion skin paper. Oh man, I couldn't do much. He said, publish whatever you want. He said, I'll call Brion. And I'm sorry, that's how I hold the phone. I said, I want to do a publishing company. It started 42 years ago this month to publish Brion Gysin. I decided he was the most fascinating man in the world. And he was, to me, as a writer, a painter, and a historian, and many other things, as Demi has told you. So I made a long-distance call to Paris, and Brion smoked a lot of grass, and he was very stoned, and he said, I don't know about this, Theo. Richard says you're cool. I don't know, man. I did it anyway. I published this kind of, I don't know if you have Beaton Museum Barlow Hotel. I did a little kind of like, if you remember the 60s and the 70s, everything was 8.5 by 11 and stapled. It's like the end of the Mimeo period, you know, no computers were involved. It was typewriters, and you'd photocopy it and staple it together. So I started a little no barcodes, no ISBNs. So I did this book from a manuscript Brion had in progress, which later became the last museum. It's his reminiscences of the old Gît Hotel in Paris that Demi talked about. So I published it, and Brion wasn't happy, and he said, look, Theo, I don't know about this arrangement. You know, I gave him that. But then I sent him I used to send it in traveler's checks, and he then said, no, don't send traveler checks. They take 20% of the bank in Paris. So I don't know that I've been sending cash to Europe for 45 years to buy weird records and books, and nothing's ever gone amiss. Nothing. So I started sending Brion cash. And when you send a writer who's complaining about money, in any format. They liked it. Totally true story. So I told him that his previous archivist and collector, Richard, said I could publish anything I want, but I need to clear it with you. And so I found a manuscript of a bunch of stories he wrote in Morocco. He was Brion was, of course, all over the map. I want to be a painter. He got kicked out of the Surrealists. I want to be a writer. I want to do sound poetry. I started Inkblot Publications again to work with Brion Gysin. It turned into something where I started publishing other people. This was all in California in the 80s and in the 90s. I did 5 books of Brion Gysin. And I did a little one called Stories, which was all the stories he wrote in Morocco, in Tangier, in the early 50s, that were, loosely based on what the style that Paul Bowles was working in then. This Moroccan situations of, things going wrong between non-Moroccans and what do you call, I don't want to just say white people, but foreigners in Tangier, for whatever reason. They were there, expats, mainly white cats before the Germans took over Tangier, which is now. And so I published several more works by Brion and went back to Paris to spend time with him. And he was skeptical of me because small press doesn't pay a lot. I said, "Here, Brion, here's $100, And then at the end of my visit, here's another $100. I don't know where I got the hundreds in those days. I must have gone to what's that famous French bank, BN Paribas, you were all into Paris, right? Or, I don't know. You just go to a bank and hey, it's me, Theo, can I have $100? So we did this book, Stories, and he was quite pleased with it, except for the typos. I had it typeset by I'd moved down to Basel. I was living in Europe that whole summer, and I moved to Basel, and I had a Swiss typesetter do the book, and his English was, shall we say, not there. So, but at the same time, on that trip at Brion's house across from the Pompidou, the Beaubourg is I met this man's father, Roger Knoebber, whose book we are featuring tonight. And Roger had known Brion and hadn't seen him in 20 plus years. And I said, God, what a fascinating man. Not just because of his mustache, but because of his past. And so I got to know Roger, and Roger, Brion was skeptical of me. I was a 28-year-old, not proven publisher. I had the long hair, and I probably wore more, forgive me, hippie-style clothes in those days, and Brion didn't really want anything to do with hippies, although he helped invent them by being, because he was a beatnik. Brion wasn't he wasn't anything. They mix him in, the historians. He was a beat writer. No. Brion was Brion. Most fascinating man I ever met. So we kept in close touch. I fell very much in love with his artwork. Began purchasing his artwork. Again, his writings, they're great, they're uneven, but you got to talk to him about history. And I wanted to know about when he took the founder of the Rolling Stones to Gît-le-Cœur to record Moroccan music. He told me the whole story. I've written about this. It's not here tonight. So I got very fascinated. Paul Bowles and Brion Gysin had the best collections of Moroccan music at that time. They used to take their tape recorders into the hills. And Brion Gysin is well quoted as saying he stayed in Morocco for 23 years so he could hear the music every day. Now he went off to Paris to the Beat Hotel, as it was called. It really had there was no name for the hotel. Historians called it the Beat Hotel because all those cats, Ginsberg and Burroughs and everybody lived there. Kerouac never lived there, regardless of what you read. He might have spent one night there and was frightened by the Turkish toilets or something. But so I kept in touch with Brion, and again met Roger Knoebber, and Brion's death sadly was in 1986, and I still had books of Brion's that I wanted to publish. I was granted the access to do so by William Burroughs and his people, and continued to do so. There's a book up here called Living with Islam, very important in these troubled times, that Brion wrote in the 50s. So I kept in touch, and I have letters, and his father somehow I lost touch with after Brion's death. If I could relive any 1 week of my life, it was the week putting the book Stories by Brion Gysin together, because we would meet every day, and the only place that he wanted to eat at was what is now known as kind of a fast food place in Paris called Flunch. Do any of you know it? It's fast lunch. I don't know. Flunch? I don't know. I said, Brion, let's go for some Moroccan. He said, no, it won't be as good as what I used to have my chef do in Morocco. He said, no, let's go to Flunch. I said, well, okay. And we'd go back to Brion's house. He told me, I said, well, what happened in Persia in the 14th century? My God. He wrote history books. I say somewhere in something that he was not trained as a historian, and he wasn't because he was able to do it. He mentioned the book on the history of slavery that he wrote. He was a complete historian. And he spoke with such elegance. His mother was a diction, how to speak properly, clearly. His mother taught diction, Stella. He hated his mother. But he was an only child, and so, a spoiled little shit. But, and he was. He did expect platters of only the finest, what are those little fish egg things called? Caviar. He did expect only the best in life. And living in the Beat Hotel didn't get it for him. And living in Morocco, well, you could live for free, as Demi said in Tangier in the 50s. You could live there for virtually nothing because of how the international zone worked and everything. So I have continued to promote Brion Gysin. I started Inkblot Publications to work with him. I went on to publish a lot of other people. I'm a painter, a visual artist, and that's very isolated. And publishing got me in touch with people around the world. half the people I know around the world these days, and I know people from Australia to India to everywhere, are because I published and knew Brion Gysin. I've met the most fascinating people. These guys and many, many others. But I began 42 years ago publishing Brion Gysin, and tonight is one of my proudest moments to publish Roger Knoebber's book, his profile of Brion Gysin. And as I say in the book, there's a biography that exists on Brion Gysin, but I found it a little bit lacking. And as I say in this book, it is as accurate a portrait of Brion as one can imagine, and I don't think it will be duplicated. And he was a very mysterious man. He did turn on a whim. Is that a word? He got a little moody. You know, he was bitter. He wanted more recognition in his lifetime. He wanted more money. And he wanted a gallery to sell his paintings. And what you were looking at behind you is, for me, other than listening to Brion, would you like another cup of tea, Theo? I mean, and I don't really smoke hash, but I did smoke with Brion a few times, and well, what can I say? I didn't flip out or anything. So, Roger's book, it's the best book I've read on Brion, and I don't think it will be duplicated. I collect Brion Gysin artwork. I still have manuscripts of his that I want to publish. I've got to go through the Wiley agency now, which I don't like to do things, you know, like the way you're supposed to do them. I like to just do them under cover of darkness. Yeah, talk to me about that. So, Inkblot Publications, I've never had a grant. I've never had anything. Its purpose was to, well, I do my own scribbles too, but its purpose was to publish Brion Gysin and promote him. And I think that I've been successful in doing that. And with the help of Demi, Cosmo, and a dear friend in Providence, Rhode Island, who did all the layout work, and Janet Galore for doing the cover of an Udo Breger picture. Brion is much more known in Europe. It's sad that he's not more known in this country. His paintings are finally getting some recognition, both primarily in Europe, but in America. You try to buy one online right now.
There's a French retrospective coming up in a couple of years.
They keep putting it off when the flu comes back. They keep putting the damn thing off. But what more can I say? He was the most inspiring, creative person I've ever met. I've met many writers, from Burroughs to countless others, and Brion will always be my God, and is and always will be. So, thank you. Thank you very much. And here's Cosmo, the son of the author. So, don't forget him.
Well, I don't have a prepared statement.
I didn't either.
I won't go as long as
But
maybe if I choke up, someone can keep me going by asking questions.
Yeah, we can do
I'm not
questions.
real good at the public thing, but so.
you
You
met
said
Brion.
I met Brion. I did. And you said talking about my childhood with my dad. Yeah, my dad was a really good dad, and he enjoyed being a dad. But he was somebody else when he moved to Paris. I didn't visit him but twice while he was in Paris. Once I went to visit him was about 17, where he did take me to Brian's apartment. It was really important for him, for me to meet Brian. Then I went back to Paris when my dad was dying. He was supposed to die, and I went over there with the intention of getting some of his stuff. This is the part that's interesting to me, because I mean, I knew my dad as my dad, but it's actually not until tonight, really, that the culmination of my last 20 years of research about who the hell my dad was and what was this other life that it came to be. And I went to Paris to see him in the hospital, and but I went with 2 empty suitcases because I knew there was important things I needed to. And as he was dying in the hospital, I was cleaning his apartment. What's this? What's that? And he was the way a writer lives. It's just a lot of stuff, papers, just to go through and go through. And so I didn't know. I knew he was doing some writing, but I didn't understand the extent and importance of Gysin. Until it took a long, long time. I came home from France with 2 suitcases, and I was kind of excited because I had researched. I stayed in his apartment for about 10 days, just going through, and wow, who are these people, and why are all these letters? And came home with this stuff, and my friends and family, I'm like, hey, I got all this news. Let's go through it. And there wasn't that much excitement except for my Auntie Sarah, who came out there. And, but basically, I took these 2 suitcases of stuff and put them in the attic. And I guess I moved just through 2 different houses, and I shepherded these things. They weren't even tightly sealed, and this stuff was loose. And in 20 years, I think I met 4 people that gave a shit about the stuff I had in the attic. Who were like, whoa, Burroughs people, and those 4 people.
Weirdos.
I had this stuff up there, and I didn't, I don't know, I liked it. I was scrolling Facebook one day, was it 4 years, 3 years ago, and
2000.
on the toilet. Burroughs, because and then I saw Gysin mentioned in that. Came off the toilet, and I went into my attic, and I got the stuff, and I laid it out on my table, and I like click, 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 and I posted.
Holy shit.
And it started, after 20 years of not just having this stuff up there, which the cat could have shit on, or whatever, the house could have burned down, it was just, and got some reaction from Eddie first, I think, and then Demi, and then Richard Aaron, and I kind of felt like I was it was really fun being able to promote my dad again. People cared, felt important. And then going through that stuff, yeah. And I had the guy came and praised it in the Beat Museum. And then Demi did fly all the way down, and we had
a great week. It was
good. And Demi is really the mastermind of the situation, because he was able to put things together, read my
He put this whole thing together.
He knows the stuff, and this is one of my favorite. Demi's down there purchasing these, taking over the archive. He was interested in these personal letters between Gysin and the colonial poems and the ephemera. I'm like, well, my dad wrote a book about Gysin, and I really wanted to see that published, because I knew that Dad had worked on it and was super depressed. My dad, as I read through his writings, he was like, I'm a published writer.
And I thought it was going to be like a short story, too. Like, I thought it was just going to be like this little flimsy thing. My dad's little memory of Brion Gysin went thunk.
And then I'm like,
the book's 250 pages.
Right, and we're going to make a deal on the archive, and you're going to take it home. I said, but I want to insist that as part of the deal, you help me publish my dad's book. He goes, no, I'm way too busy. Like, damn, well, okay, I'll take the money anyway. And and over time, then I started I was working with the publisher and,
It turns all.
yeah, and a year and a half later, it's not going anywhere, and then we started a little interest on this
Yeah, I don't see
proofread.
it falling
Anyways,
around.
in one way or another, I tricked him into publishing this book for us. Yeah. And so, and it's like, I gave up, it's hard, it's a lot of work getting this, Dad, I thought that Dad had a pretty good manuscript, but no.
No, it was good.
It needed a
And
lot
I
of work.
probably did editing passes about 8 times on it.
A lot of work, and I'm just so happy that it's culminated. I feel like this 20 years of my researching my dad and figuring this out and stuff, it's come to about, and because of Demi, mostly.
It was a hard book to read originally. I don't think it's as
Very
hard now. I hope it's not. If it
But
is,
remember-
you could blame me, but like, the formatting of this book really was something that we had to play with a little bit, because it's really polyvocal. I mean, it's got you're getting 2 bios in one, really. You're getting Gysin, you're getting Knoebber. And you're not only that, but you're getting all these other friends of Gysin bubbling up in different places. And sometimes it can be a little confusing to go, wait, who's speaking now? Or, what's the, where's the transition here? And so part of the editing
But
process
it's
is
still-
putting that in.
It's easy to read.
Now it is.
Now it is, it was not, and also because my dad had hand typed it on this old
On the old
typewriter.
Royal
So I could
typewriter.
go from italics to,
Brian Gysin had owned.
In the
and,
hotel, 1946 Royal Portable.
yeah, and then a lot of writers had written on that.
Yeah,
One of my
yeah,
great,
so I think.
I couldn't fit it in a suitcase. I had to
Probably
leave it
the
there.
But they first hired some, I'm gonna call them flake publishers.
Let's not talk bad.
All right, I will.
Oh, my people, that Frank taught me over there.
But it was-
They got the ball rolling in
Yeah,
a
it's
sense.
fortuitous for you.
They caused Demi to read it.
That's true.
And then when you read it, you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
This needs a little work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
someone did the little early pass on typing it out, and I'm like, oh my God.
You found some
I
mistakes.
said, this is so good, the material's so good, but we just need to, someone needs to, and I'm like, oh shit, I should do it.
And after so long, and there's my dad
We'll take that.
speaking
We'll
over
take
there,
questions.
which is, I have never seen this footage of him reading the poem of poems in Paris, and it's a really moving experience to be here.
This
For
is
sure.
special too. So the poems typescript we talked about came from Brion Gysin to Roger Knoebber. On the right side, on those copies, are Roger Knoebber's version of the poem of poems. So once he got this, he basically said, I own it in some sense. Did a little editing of it and would do performances of it. He did 7, 8 performances of poem of poems, different places, in Shakespeare and Company. This one is at the Village Voice Bookstore in Paris. There, he did it for the BBC.
And in what year was that?
This is 1990. This is February 23rd, 1990.
The 23rd, in fact.
Yeah, 23rd, auspicious day.
It was a big day in Dad's life too, but
Yeah.
it's about that a lot.
Thank you for asking us to be part of this.
Well, been a pleasure.
Um,
And I'm so happy that Demi now is in, how do we say, shepherding the archive and making it available to anybody. All this stuff that was in my attic that poor people looked at in 20
Never
years.
done.
Now you can go online
as of
and look
today.
through it. and
Yeah.
It's amazing, and I feel super happy and fulfilled in this. I couldn't be happier with it.
It's lovely to support the family, and I really do think, having read Roger Knoebber, I really do hope to see some more in print in the future. I think that would be.
I have a lot more manuscripts.
Yeah, and
He's
publishers.
basically an unknown repeat writer in a sense, right? I have, it's a long shot, but maybe.
If you sweet talk me, maybe I'll edit. I know we're a little over time what we said we were going to do. I don't want to bore anyone to tears. Do you mind if I read just a couple more things? I want to read, I'm not going to read too much from, I do want to read at least one excerpt from Hysteresis, one recollection from someone. I'm going to do someone that maybe not everyone knows, too, which I think is kind of a nice, everyone knows Burroughs. Burroughs is in here. Terry Wilson, who interviewed Gysin, is in here. There's a bunch of people who people know. Mitchell Motto, who's they're in here. Irene Ayeti, but who sang with Gysin with Lacey. I'm going to read Gabriel Morgan. Gabriel Morgan is Ted Morgan's son. Ted Morgan is trying to remember his
Sanche de Gramont.
Sanche de Gramont, thank you very much. And changed his name at one point. He wrote the first large biography of Burroughs. And Gabriel Morgan, his son, was brought to meet Brion Gysin by Ted Morgan. And this is his recollection of that experience of getting to know Brion Gysin. Okay. I'm glad to oblige your request for remarks about Brion Gysin. Brion is vivid in my memory. First, let me say that my father, the writer Ted Morgan, wrote a portrait of Brion, which appeared in a book of stories called Rowing Towards Eden. And the name of the story is What I Know About Brion. You would find it indispensable. It's a great little essay in a really, really nice book. In Tangier, I went with my mother, and now it seems to me sometimes alone to see Brion in a long, thin flat overlooking a square near the post office. He lived on a high floor, ideal for observing the sort of crowd scenes he painted. The many binoculars he owned were extremely diverting to a child such as I was. It seems to keep the building in which he lived was one of the tallest in Tangier and had a row of windows quite like the storefront. It was set up for painting, and at the time he used an easel, and the roller paintings came later. Roller paintings are kind of this print. Brion had a penchant for the Planet of the Apes series of movies. I thought that was funny too. He took me to one in 1973 or 74 in Paris and regarded the outing as a crucial pedagogic duty. I think my Catholic great-grandmother scarcely sneaked me into my baptism more earnestly than Brion conveyed to me, return to the Planet of the Apes. Brion was a charming, mesmeric talker, certainly not the quack some people have taken him for, and in hindsight I see that his interests were all accurate and purposeful, indeed very often prophetic. His dream machine, for example, anticipated some recent experiments in brain science crudely realized with electronic visors, whereas Brion had that beautiful turntable device. I considered the dream machine an outright marvel, and it beat me how such a revolutionary appliance could miss mass production while banalities such as a microwave oven and the electric toothbrush are foisted on the consuming public instead. I like that. Later in the 1980s, Brion made 2 trips to New York. He was undimmed by illness. He stayed with us. I remember his trademark Indian silk shirts hanging up. He was reading a biography of Talleyrand. Later, he moved from our place to the Chelsea Hotel, very briefly, where he was delighted to encounter Boy George. MTV, he loved pop stuff. Like he kept with the times in some sense, which I think is really kind of unique too for people as they get older. MTV ravished Brion. He played it constantly in his hotel room. His assorted connections with the European rock scene, known the Stones, David Bowie, Iggy Pop, Genesis George, among others, made the New York scene immediately accessible to him. I think it was at this time that his friendship with Keith Haring originated. Anyone who received Brion's attention quickly came to the realization he was in the presence of a great teacher. Brion invited me one evening to meet Thelonious Monk. Now, Brion Gysin also knew a lot of jazz musicians, and you'll find a lot of name dropping in here. I put a cast of characters in the back of the book to help people out who don't know all the references. Which some of them I had to learn myself. I think Billie Holiday used to sell them pot and stuff, like crazy stories. So he invited me one evening to meet Thelonious Monk at the Baroness Panonica's in New Jersey, where Monk had advanced Parkinson's disease or something equally as dreadful. I demurred and said rather cynically, just what any baroness would want, a genius become a dribbling dependent. Ignorant as I was to that woman's long relationship with Monk, Brion was shocked at my reply. You are worse than your father, he said, referring to my cynicism. Brion recommended books to me, such as Dame Frances Yates' The Art of Memory. He was one of the few friends who came out to Mammoth Lakes, California to visit us in a condominium village 7,000 feet up in the Sierras. It wasn't exactly Brion's scene. 2 men came along with him, and they made many recordings. There was, it seems to me, always a recording device around Brion. His fidelity to the reel-to-reel uher is well known. Now, I recall a visit to the flat across the Center Pompidou in Paris with my cousin Alex. Betty Vreeland was leaving as we arrived, and again, a long, well-organized railroad flat in the ultra-submarine mode. Later, Brion said, so you thought I'd go to your cousin, hey? And I was baffled. I realized that Alex had been wearing shorts. Now, think of it, it's like hot cousin. I realized Alex had been wearing shorts because Brion said, surely you were showing me those meaty thighs. I thought it was a peculiar idea for him to have that I might procure my cousin for him. Brion gave the name of the discotheque and advised us to use his name. We did so and received a hostile response from the entry. Is it a joke? As I recall, call Brion, the important thing seems not to serve up anecdotes, but to reinstate his work. It is vindicated. It is good. Brion and Burroughs took some of the preoccupations of the surrealists to another level, and their work was serious. Thank you, buddy. It was earnest, angry magic. The Dream Machine is no gimmick. As we learn more about dreams and clear away all the Freudian horseshit, we see that Brion was right on track. He was offering us our own algorithmic rhythm, algorithmic spelled with rhythm, visions more precious than all tourism, drugs, or libidinous candies of our era. It doesn't work out on the human level. Inspiration is what passes, not portraiture. Brion Gysin, William Burroughs, those lives are either instructive or otherwise you choose. The syntax, the vision, you incorporate it or you don't. Brion's writing was profuse and overwrought. It's too bad he didn't stay another 20 years. Young artists that I meet in New York know about Brion, and his tutelage does exist. Right. I was going to read more, but I'm just going to read Gît afterwards, and I think I'll open it up for some question and answer. I do want to say, though, one of the things I wanted to read was this great recollection, I can share it with you later, by Felicity Mason. And Felicity Mason was an amazing personality. Met Brion Gysin in Marrakesh, and very quickly became fast friends. And Brion often kind of bad talked women, but he actually loved a lot of women, and as friends. And Felicity Mason was the closest. He would have called her pseudo sister. Most of the time, called her, "It's my pseudo sister." Felicity Mason was a libertine, even into her old age. Would hit on young men and usually get them. And wrote a couple of books as under her pen name Anne Cumming, which Love Habit and Love Quest are the most well-known ones. They're very saucy. She's like the modern Annalise Nin, really, with a little extra spark. And
she was pretty good friends with my dad.
She was, and Roger was really hot for her. Yeah, she was. And there's some playful flirtation when she's 72, flirting with Roger. Anyhow, there's a great recollection by her that's in this book, which is a little more extended in this book, but the one in here that goes into also the funeral of Gysin. This is Jose Perez Curry's catalog. Tuning into the multimedia age is not an expensive book to get.
The best book of Brion's visual.
Yeah, it's a fantastic.
By the way, there have been several. This is still the
highly
best
recommend
one.
it, and I don't want to recommend anything but Inkblot tonight, but I'll recommend it.
Recommend that.
Yeah.
Two great takes.
And they're very affordable
Yeah,
somehow on the internet.
I don't know why secondhand copies come real easy on that. And it's a big book.
It'll end eventually.
Beautiful, beautiful paintings and illustrations.
The best book of
And the essays are brilliant in this.
You don't know.
You gotta have a copy of this. Okay, so I'm gonna read it afterward, and I'm gonna open it up for, this is by Roger Knoebber, and then I'm gonna open it up for Q&A, just in case we missed something or something was burning in your heads. Okay, this little book was completed 10 years to the day after Brion Gysin's death. It is a modest commemoration. His life deserves a far more careful and thorough documentation than Hysteresis aspires to deliver. Hopefully others will take up the pen to shed more illumination on Brion's life and career. Again, this was written in '96. We've had some books since, which is great. If Hysteresis generates such a response in the future, I will judge my efforts successful and may this book do well. Hysteresis is an attempt to convey to the general reader the powerful influence which Brion Gysin exerted on the creative world during his productive years. His influence was at once subtle and far-ranging. He was always in the avant-garde of creativity. He was a writer's writer, painter's painter. He may have been in the wrong age. The 60s and 70s were marked by passivity, which caused many creative persons to become entertainers to compete with the glut of trivial information available on various media systems. Science and technology did indeed make more leisure time, but those forces were equally employed to cause people to use more products with which to enhance that leisure time. That sounds very familiar. The role of the consumer was thus created, and in many ways the artist became part of the system. Burroughs' powerful force of absorption, in quotes. Brion Gysin was somewhat displaced in such a world, for he arranged his life so that it was all leisure time. In such an economic climate, such works as he accomplished seemed almost offhand and casual. However, nothing could be more distant from the truth. Brion made work and play one and the same thing. In a roundabout way, then, you can perceive Brion Gysin as an intense and dedicated worker. Brion was a character created by his own imagination, self-generated persona. That word comes from the Latin personal, literally through which the sound comes. In simple terms, Brion's character was a word mask. Conversation with Brion involved a dazzling array of arcane historical knowledge, informed speculation, bizarre recollection, and provocative thought. I know of no one who felt that time sure that Brion was ill spent, as Theo says. There is but one chapter in Hysteresis, let's check. The segmented entries in chapter 23, and they lack continuity. That was intended. Brion Gysin was a man of many chapters and a steady, invigorating continuity, yet he was a man whose life did not readily lend itself to a biographical ladder of causes and effects. Therefore, in Hysteresis, I attempted to document his achievements as a painter, a poet, a performer, a novelist, an inventor, and a historian in roughly equal parts, and there are likely significant omissions in that recounting. To many readers, a significant omission will be reproductions of his paintings. There is one in here, which I showed you, which we put later. There are none, because a photograph of a painting is not a painting, so Roger would disagree, no matter how skilled a photographer. Brion Gysin knew himself in a way that is rare among people. That knowledge was at once a strength and a weakness, for it acted as times as a check rein on his creativity and caused impulsive reactions on many occasions, when circumspect prudence would have served him far better. The fictitious conversations in this book are intended to give a range, an idea of the range of Brion's imagination, certainly not to be construed as indicative of his thinking. The same must be said of the liberties I took with William Burroughs. Those conversations, there's a conversation between Burroughs and Gysin here, which is fictitious. Their collaboration is familiar and characterized by noble attitude and mutual respect throughout their careers. Last paragraph. Such conversations I contrived between Brion and myself have little basis in fact, but are intended to invoke an idea of Brion as an imaginer of the highest order. Such active minds as his are rare not only in our time but throughout history. Few people live life so passionately as he did, and one might say that Brion used life. He was constantly aware of possibilities and conceptions which other people might have discarded as unachievable. And in the foreword of this book, I made a distinct reference to the unknowability of Brion Gysin. I continue to hold that view, and while writing, I have edged closer to an understanding of Brion than I had before, and that is a measure of satisfaction. Some of these readers who knew Brion will disagree entirely with certain of my speculations and conclusions, and I remind readers of Brion's paradoxical nature reflected in his labyrinthine thinking. Those readers who did not know Brion Gysin might appreciate him as one of the great artistic intellects of our time, impetus of a movement which continues in the absence of its source, Hysteresis. Paris, 1996. Thanks for your time. And thanks for your patience. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to get the timeline straight. You two met online,
Yes.
but you knew Theo published Brion Gysin?
Yeah, I was a fan of Theo's books. For a
So
long
then
time.
you connected, and you brought Theo in after you.
I introduced them.
Well, we might have a variance, because I think I mentioned Theo, and I might have mentioned him to Richard, and I think to you, and I said, he's a good person, because we were talking about publishers for the book.
Right.
And I think I came up with a couple of names. I said, but Theo, really knows Brion Gysin stuff.
You
And
knew
I
of
think-
him for a while, but you hadn't known him yet.
I didn't know him yet, so yes, you connected us personally, but I think the idea
Oh,
of
that's
bring
weird, so I happened to meet him.
Yeah.
Whoa.
You
So-
knew of me from my previous publication.
yes, I'm a Theo fan.
Yeah.
You know, I want one more thing. Demi had asked me, and I was supposed to maybe try and write some introduction or something to this book, and I didn't think I was a good enough writer, and I tried, and Demi nicely. So,
Second
But-
edition, we're going to hold you to it.
but what I did kind of insist on including was something I really liked that my dad wrote. It's called Raincoat Jones, and it's sort of an essay on how important people. It's just a quickie, and it's easy reading for me, and I like it a lot, and I'm glad we included it in
Yeah.
the very back of the
Yeah.
book. And that's
Thank you.
sort of, I feel like, my contribution, because I insisted that I want this Raincoat Jones in there.
That's a great idea.
And it
Great name.
teaches you how to be, sort of. It's sort of, it's a real condensation of, in my feeling, the importance of great people and how you can be.
It's also a great example of Roger's writing outside of Hysteresis. And I
Right.
think that's nice. So this is that's included in this as a kind of secondary bonus, I guess. There's also a bio and resume that he wrote in '96 when he was kicked out of his Rue Temple apartment and was looking to get established in kind of an artist commune in Paris. And so he kind of pumped himself up. It's a lovely example of an artist trying to make them, I did all these things. But it's also has a great chronology of all the kind of some of the major life events of Roger Knoebber, which otherwise you wouldn't get.
Which you translated out of French.
I translated in French, yeah.
I have a great question. Now that this process is complete, bringing this manuscript to fruition, how has your relationship to your dad changed, or has your understanding changed?
Incredibly. I knew him as a dad, but, now it's like, whoa. He had a whole entire, he reinvented himself like Raincoat Jones would suggest, He went to Paris and he was a writer, and it's impressive, He was a smart dude, and I didn't spend a lot of time, but, I got to know him very well, particularly, Theo knows him, and Demi.
There's a lot of correspondence.
I can ask Demi, hey, when did my whole lot happen? We worked together, and it's been real nice. And
Thanks to the archive you saved, through Demi and I think Cosmo, every letter, Roger had hit me up to be his publisher on some of his unpublished manuscripts. And it went back and forth, and then he said, no, I want this other one done. And I said, oh dear God, I've been, considering this woo. But every letter that I sent to Roger and every letter he sent to me are, he had saved them all.
I'm bringing them home.
And now Demi
I have the history of it.
owns them all and is gonna, because in those days, you have to remember, pre-computer people wrote on typewriters, and they would save a carbon copy of what they sent on a typewriter, airmail, and you'd send those on onion skin paper, to keep the weight down. So every letter between Roger's copies, and then the ones I sent, I never kept
You could make a book about that. There's a lot of correspondence.
So Roger and I corresponded a lot, and I almost published him. And then he said, no, I want you to consider this other publication. And I said, oh, Roger. So
There's no money in publishing.
there's no money in funding. There can be, but I've never made a dime in 42 years of publishing. But I've met a lot of great people.
I know we diverged. Did that answer the question?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
he was supposed to be short.
Any other questions? All right.
I just want to say something
Yeah.
as someone who loves Gysin so much and knows him to be an exceptionally important, unknown luminary who inspired so many people, visual artists and musicians, and above all, Burroughs.
Yeah.
And Burroughs didn't really have very many equals in terms of his intellect and his progressive experimentalism. But Gysin was right there and was so elemental in amplifying through dialogues with Burroughs. And anybody who did know him was very passionate about how astonishingly brilliant and important he was. And I'm so happy, and I bow before you, because Theo and Demi here have the same love and passion for him that so many great people, cultural figures. And I'm so grateful to you guys. And I'm grateful to you, Cosmo, for being an archivist and holding on to such important documents. And Gysin was a hairbreadth away so many times in his life from becoming
success,
enormously famous.
The way it would come, and his timing was just.
But he also admitted, I had that painting sold to you. I fucked up the sale. I mean, he knew that he was occasionally his own worst enemy. So it's almost that he didn't want it, fame. He wanted money, and he did want recognition.
It's hard to get everything.
But what do? You're Brion Gysin, and now, you know, like, and everyone wants to knock on your door. Yeah, from Bowie to
Yeah, exactly.
everybody, these, you know, young English kids and Throbbing Gristle and everybody.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, oh my God, keep these cats away from me, man.
But I think it's so cool that it finally landed somewhere, you know, appropriately. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the universe works in strange ways. Thank you for the comment, I really appreciate that. And if there's no other questions, I'll also just, you know, a little bit about the works on the wall. So we'll get up and wander around, people want to go, that's fine, but if you want to talk longer, we'll talk longer. I love that. Some of these photographs, especially these two, about around 1960 at the Gît-le-Cœur. This is Roger Knoebber era. This is when Gysin was deeply in love with Roger. And
But we didn't
and these
mention
are by Harriet
our
Crowder.
kids.
These are original photographs by her. Udo Greger gave, allowed me to print these two, which are in this book, which is wonderful. Boborg stuff, of course, there's a lot of posters, roller stuff. This is the Here to Go show. This was organized by Frank Green, Joe Ambrose, and Barry Wilson, who did an interview book with Brion Gysin. Really nice poster to have. And from a Ruby Portfolio 4, which was partially organized by Henri Chopin, this is a print by Gysin, some photographic kind of pictures embedded, and it's quite a nice little thing. The videos on the side, we have, if you put the headphones on, it's Brion Gysin teaching, to kind of munged version of Anthony Balch's The Cutouts on the video. So this is someone made a little fan video I thought was actually really good for hearing Gysin and give you some visual information, some vision of him painting and doing some other things. And of course, Roger Knoebber reading the poems. Thank you for your time, thank you for your patience, and any questions, come on.